Farooq was never meant to survive. The first time I saw him, he was wrapped in dirty rags, left in the cold outside our village's only clinic. He was so small, so frail, that it seemed impossible he would live through the night. But he did. Against all odds, he did. We didn't know his name back then. He was just the baby, left by someone who didn't want him, or maybe couldn't keep him. No one in the village wanted to take him in. They said he was cursed, a child of misfortune. Farooq wasn't supposed to live, but he did. And with every breath he took, the world around him began to change in ways no one could explain. I was there through it all. This is how I know the story so well. I was the one who refused to turn my back on him, even when others did. And what I witnessed, what we all witnessed, haunts me to this day. It was a cold night in June, not like the usual warm evenings we were used to. I was working the night shift at the clinic, just me and the old nurse, Mama Dogo. She had seen it all, births, deaths, the joys, and the sorrows of our village. But even she was shaken when we heard the faint cry outside. At first, it was so soft that it almost seemed like the wind whispering. But then it grew louder, more desperate. I went out to see what it was, and there, by the door, was the smallest baby I had ever seen. His skin was almost blue from the cold, and his cries were so weak, I thought he wouldn't make it another minute. Mama Dogo took one look at him and crossed herself, mumbling something under her breath. She said the child was an omen, born under a dark star. I didn't understand what she meant, but I could see the fear in her eyes. And when the villagers came the next morning, they said the same. Farooq's arrival was just the beginning. The very next day, the skies darkened, and a heavy rain fell, flooding the village. Crops were destroyed, and the river swelled, washing away homes. People started to say that the baby brought the storm, that his presence was a curse. No one wanted him. The chief's wife, who usually took in orphans, refused to even look at him. "This child will bring nothing but sorrow," she said. "I cannot take him." Others murmured in agreement, crossing their arms and shaking their heads. But I couldn't leave him. He was just a baby, innocent and helpless. I wasn't a mother, I wasn't even married, but something in me couldn't walk away. I convinced Mama Dogo to let me care for him at the clinic, at least until we could find someone who would take him in. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one came forward. The storms continued, and people whispered more and more about the cursed child. The village had never seen such bad weather, and it wasn't just the rain. Livestock died mysteriously, and people fell ill without explanation. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting us. One night, an old medicine man who had been away traveling returned to the village. When he heard about the child, he came to the clinic. His face was stern, and his eyes were full of knowledge that only someone who had lived many years could possess. He looked at Farooq and shook his head. "This child is not meant for this world," he said. "He was rejected by the spirits, left to die, but someone interfered." A chill ran down my spine. Was he talking about me? Had I done something wrong by saving him? "The spirits do not want him here," the medicine man continued. "He will bring darkness wherever he goes. The longer he stays, the worse it will get." But what was I supposed to do? Let him die? Abandon him in the forest? I couldn't. I had seen the life in his eyes, the fight in his tiny body. He wanted to live, and I couldn't take that away from him. As the months passed, Farooq grew stronger, but so did the fear in the village. The storms didn't stop, and every time they came, they were worse than before. People lost everything, homes, crops, even family members. And they blamed the child. I tried to shield him from the whispers, from the hate. But it was impossible. People would stop me in the street, telling me to get rid of him, to send him away. Some even suggested taking him to the river and letting the current carry him away. But I held on. I kept him safe, kept him fed, and watched him grow. And as he grew, I started to notice things I couldn't explain. He was too smart for his age, understanding things no child should. And his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a baby. They were old, wise beyond his years. One day, while I was feeding him, he looked up at me and said, "Mama, why do they hate me?" I was stunned. He had barely learned to talk, yet here he was, asking a question that broke my heart. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that people feared what they didn't understand? How could I tell him they thought he was cursed? So I lied. I told him they didn't hate him, that they were just scared. But I don't think he believed me. His eyes were too knowing, too understanding. By the time Farooq was 5, the village was in ruins. The storms had destroyed most of the crops, and the animals that hadn't died were too weak to be of any use. People were starving, and disease was spreading. The once vibrant community was now a shadow of its former self. And still, they blamed Farooq. They would come to the clinic at night, pounding on the doors, demanding that I hand him over. They said they would take him to the forest, leave him there for the spirits to claim. They said it was the only way to save the village. But I couldn't do it. I had raised him, cared for him, and loved him as if he were my own. I couldn't just let him go. So I hid him. I kept him inside, away from the villagers, away from their hate. But it wasn't enough. The fear in the village grew, and so did the anger. And one night, it all came to a head. I remember that night vividly. The air was thick with tension, and the sky was darker than I had ever seen it. There was no storm, no rain, but the silence was deafening. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then they came. A group of men, led by the chief himself, came to the clinic. They were carrying torches, and their faces were twisted with anger. They didn't knock, they didn't ask. They just barged in, demanding that I hand over Farooq. I stood in front of him, trying to protect him, but they were too strong. They grabbed me, pushed me aside, and took him. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just looked at me with those old, wise eyes, and said, "It's okay, Mama. I'll be okay." But I knew he wouldn't be. They took him to the forest, deep into the heart of the wilderness, and left him there. They said it was for the good of the village, that the spirits would take him and the curse would be lifted. But I knew better. I knew they were condemning him to die. Days passed, and the village waited. They expected the storms to stop, the crops to grow back, and the animals to recover. But nothing changed. If anything, things got worse. And then, one night, a year after they had taken him, Farooq returned. He walked into the village, barefoot and dirty, but alive. His eyes were brighter than ever, and there was a strange calmness about him. The villagers were terrified. They couldn't understand how he had survived, how he had found his way back. But he didn't speak. He just walked through the village, his presence sending shivers down everyone's spines. He didn't come to me, didn't come to the clinic. He just walked, as if he was searching for something. And then he found it. The village's chief was the first to fall. Farooq found him in his hut, surrounded by his family, and just stared at him. The chief tried to speak, tried to apologize, but no words came out. He just fell to the ground, lifeless. One by one, the men who had taken Farooq to the forest met the same fate. They would see him, try to speak, and then die. No one could explain it, but everyone knew that Farooq was responsible. But it wasn't just them. The storms stopped, the crops began to grow again, and the animals recovered. The village started to heal, but the fear didn't go away. People were terrified of Farooq, and they avoided him at all costs. But he didn't care. He was no longer the scared, fragile baby I had found all those years ago. He had grown into something else, something powerful. Farooq's presence in the village changed everything. People were too scared to oppose him, too scared to even speak his name. And so, when he started making decisions, no one questioned him. He became the de facto leader, guiding the village with a calm, almost eerie authority. And then, as he grew older, he left the village. He went to the city, where he studied medicine, politics, and law. He became a doctor, a lawyer, a man of power. But he never forgot the village, never forgot the people who had rejected him. Years passed, and Farooq's name became known across the country. He was praised for his intelligence, his leadership, his ability to make things happen. He became a governor, the youngest the state had ever seen, and then, the chief of all medical practitioners. But no one knew his past. No one knew the truth about who he was, where he came from, or what he was capable of. Except for me. I was old by then, too old to walk, too old to do much of anything. But I still remembered everything. I remembered the night I found him, the storms, the fear, and the way he had come back from the forest. One day, many years after he had left the village, Farooq returned. He was no longer the small, fragile baby I had saved, no longer the boy who had asked me why people hated him. He was a man now, powerful and confident. But when he saw me, his eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw the child I had raised. He thanked me, told me that he would never forget what I had done for him, and then he told me the truth. He wasn't just a child of misfortune. He was something else, something ancient and powerful. The spirits hadn't rejected him, they had feared him. They had known what he was, what he would become, and they had tried to stop him. But they had failed. And now, he was unstoppable. I never saw him again after that. But I didn't need to. I knew what he was, what he had become. And I knew that the world would never be the same. Farooq had been rejected by the village, but he had survived. And in doing so, he had become something more, something that no one could control. He had risen to power, not because he wanted it, but because it was his destiny. And as I lay in my bed, waiting for the end, I couldn't help but wonder if the village had made a terrible mistake. Because in rejecting Farooq, they had created something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined.